War is no longer a necessity or a struggle for survival. It has turned into a business model that generates profit. The biggest example of this is the United States. The bloody and brutal nature of wars may not have changed yet, but their relationship with money has changed dramatically. The biggest example is America. Starting from the First World War, the United States created a system in which the wars it fought were no longer a necessity but had turned into a source of income. In this system that was created when a bomb exploded in one place, money began to accumulate and wealth began to form in another place. The beginning of this order goes back to the years when old Europe collapsed. In the First World War, European states did not lose territory or battles at first. The biggest thing they lost was the money in their treasury. It became so large that countries could no longer carry it. Steel, coal, ammunition, food, everything was running out rapidly. But for the newly risen America, this picture was not destruction. It was a huge opportunity in its favor. Because war left European states helpless, the state looking for money to cover the costs had no choice but to borrow. American banks stepped in exactly at this point of opportunity. But these were not central banks. They were the private banks owned and controlled by J.P. Morgan. They gave billions of dollars in loans to England and France so they could cover their expenses and debts. The wheat, steel, fuel, and ammunition purchased with these loans were once again bought from America. In other words, while Europe was fighting and burning through everything, all its essential needs were supplied from inside America. The lender was America. The seller was also America. The money left Europe and returned to America again. This created an enormous growth opportunity for the U.S. Every shell exploding in the trenches turned into an interest payment in America. And at this point, war went far beyond the battlefield for America. Although wars are full of suffering and pain, for America this turned directly into financial profit. It did not take long for America to realize that war had become a source of income. This situation had both advantages and disadvantages, because even though it profited from war, it tied America to the fate of the war. If the Allies it had lent money to lost the war, Morgan's loans would default, and he would return empty-handed, because no one can collect money from someone who loses. So America's entrance into the war was not a voluntary choice. It became a financial necessity. That is another topic for another video, including Morgan's influence over the press and how he guided the public toward entering the war willingly. But here we will not talk about that. Before America even sent any soldiers anywhere, it was already fighting at the front of the financial battlefield. This became the first major bond between war and money for America. However, as we said, wars brought many unknowns and difficulties with them. When the state could not cover these expenses alone, the public became the largest source of money and was pulled into the financial burden. War bonds, called Liberty Bonds, symbols of patriotism, were sold to millions of Americans. Huge nationwide campaigns were launched to promote them. Posters were hung in streets. Celebrities encouraged people. Even children contributed by buying thrift stamps. For the first time, a country financed war not primarily from its treasury, but by placing the financial burden on the shoulders of its own citizens. It was a clever system. But the real winner of this system was not the people. While crumbs of the earnings were given to the public, the unseen and unquestioned large portion of the profit went to the giant weapons manufacturing companies and the financial institutions owned by those who provided credit. As the war progressed, factories began to be built in various fields. Instead of 2 shifts, they ran on 3-shift systems at full capacity. As they grew, orders grew, new factories opened. On one side of the world, cities and lives were being destroyed. On the other, in America, cities and lives were being built. Its economy was growing. War was no longer a military struggle for America. It had turned into a smokeless factory that generated money. The government spent under the excuse of war. Industrialists profited. Banks collected easy interest, and the people became indebted. As long as this cycle worked, war was not a disaster in America's eyes. It was an economic opportunity that absolutely had to be won. The First World War showed America something very clearly. When structured correctly, war is an endless source of income. And this was just the beginning. The real transformation came in the next war. A bigger, more comprehensive, easier to profit from war that even changed the shape of money itself. In this second major breaking point, America placed itself not only militarily, but financially at the center of the world, and war turned into a near-mechanical business model in its hands. The period in which America expanded the war and reshaped money, even though it looked like an unavoidable necessity that must be intervened, was not actually like that. The First World War had shown America how easy it was to profit from war. But the real great opportunity came with a far more destructive war. The Second World War was the breaking point that completely changed America's production power and monetary system. Because although it did not enter the war directly at first, from then on it would be directly inside it. From this period onward, war became not just a conflict or chaos for America, but a permanent wartime economic system that carried its economy. When the new war began, whatever the reason, Europe, which had not yet recovered even slightly, began to collapse again. The already exhausted states were losing even more people and were being economically wiped out much worse than before. But America, using what it learned from the First War and turning it into advantage, entered the stage in a very different way. Roosevelt's phrase, "arsenal of democracy," was not an empty slogan. America truly turned into a mechanism capable of supplying all the ammunition the world needed. This time it wasn't just selling steel, wheat, and coal. Because it was now directly involved in the war, it was also producing planes, tanks, ships, and ammunition. American factories were working at full capacity even before the United States officially entered the war. And once it directly intervened in the war, it used this capacity perfectly to meet the enormous demand, becoming the lifeblood of the economy. But the real power of this was not only in production, the real power was in how money was moved. The same strategic method used by governments during the First World War was brought to a much larger and broader scale this time. Just like in the First World War, the same actions were repeated again. As the government could not cover the expenses, the public was indebted once more. War bonds returned to the stage. The U.S. Treasury printed bonds. The Federal Reserve supported these bonds. And millions of American citizens invested their savings in these bonds to show their patriotism, to feel like they were supporting their country and for the sake of democracy. More than 85 million Americans bought war bonds, and in total, over $185 billion, an enormous amount even for that time, was collected. Although this amount looked huge, it only financed a little more than half of the war's total cost. The burden of the war spread onto the shoulders of the public, but the largest share of the profits, as always in history, went to the elite wealthy who ran the big corporations. They used wars as a tool to fill their own pockets. All the major American companies of that period, Ford, Boeing, General Motors, all of them stopped civilian production and took massive war contracts. Why would companies take on such risky production during a war? The explanation is simple. The government covered the cost, the companies produced, and the profit they would earn was guaranteed by the government. In other words, the government guaranteed and provided the opportunity for companies to take their profits. These were not just empty promises. This topic is much debated, but one fact is clear. Companies did not even need to produce efficiently. The important thing was simply to continue producing. The goal was to generate profit. Thus the wars, which caused social, psychological, and economic destruction for their people, turned into a continuous stream of income for them. During this period, war not only evolved the industrial factories, but also changed the foundation of money itself. America temporarily halted gold outflows during the war. That is, the dollars linked to gold was suspended. What did this mean? It signaled a new era in which money would not rely on physical value, but on the abstract promise and power of governments. When the war ended, this arrangement became permanent. With the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, the dollar, belonging to the United States, the flagship of the war, was chosen as the world's official reserve currency, because the only economy capable of carrying the entire financial weight of the war was America. This added even more power to a country that already had production strength and had carried the war on its back. Other countries were in debt, but America had expanded its production power and financial network through the iron grip of the war economy so much that the dollar was no longer just money. It became the foundation of America's global power as a world game setter. This was a historical breaking point for America. War was no longer just a victory won with blood, nor merely a source of profit. War had become a tool that allowed America to control the world's money and directly influence the economies of all nations. The formula America learned in the First World War. War equals profit turned into something even larger in the Second War. War equals becoming the owner of the world's money. But this system had a consequence. If war strengthened money, money financed more war. That is why in America, war was not seen as an exception. It became a rescue mechanism used regularly when economic problems emerged. War had ended, but the new money machine created by the war kept turning. Did production for war need stop after the war ended? Of course not. It continued and even increased. Factories did not close. The defense budget did not decrease. New threats were introduced or created and lined up. When the time came, each one was ignited. The war economy was no longer a temporary period. It had become a permanent structure. This structure became the main mechanism that determined America's economic growth and its political and military power in the world. And at exactly this point, the system created to cover war expenses produced this result. Military expenditures began to be used not only during wartime, but also to keep the economy alive during peacetime. In other words, economic activity became largely sustained by defense spending. But the biggest fracture of this new order, the thing that changed the world's direction at that time, would not come from wars, but from America's own decision. So what was it? A decision made in 1971 completely changed the fate of the dollar and the money of war. Breaking the link between money and gold made the financing of war limitless. Why did America choose such a method? Why did the world leave its existing course and take the step that led to today's economy? The Vietnam War became the first major fracture, showing that America's treasury had no money, but the war continued. And even if the war ended, it showed that money itself had already decayed. The Vietnam War cost America more than $100 billion. Today, this may sound small, but with the value of money at that time, this number was almost unimaginable. The expenses of this war consumed not only ammunition and soldiers, but also the psychology and economic structure inside America. Under President Johnson, this was like a candle burning from both ends, consuming the people and the money at the same time. And finally, what had to happen happened. The money was not enough. The government borrowed. A massive amount of dollars was pushed into the market, and the result entered history as the Vietnam inflation. Prices rose rapidly not only inside the American domestic market but all around the world, and even though the dollar's power was strong, its value began to fall. The cost of the war entered all the way into people's kitchens. The financial burden of the war fell hardest on the millions who understood the reason for the war the least, or not at all. This contradiction exploded in 1971 when Richard Nixon completely cut the dollar's link with gold. With this step, the dollar suddenly stopped being something with physical value and turned into a fiat money that depended only on the power of the government's promise. And this decision made the financing of war infinite, meaning, to obtain money, the state gained the power to print as much as it wanted, because now gold was no longer required to print money. Need money to cover war expenses? Print. Need debt? Write it. This decision both changed and strengthened the secret engine of modern wars. Finding money was now no longer a problem, and it was easy. But like every easy path, this had a cost future generations would have to pay. But America did not stop there. Because it knew its dollar had weakened, it tried to stop this at least a little, or protect its reputation, to strengthen the dollar, by creating a new system, the petrodollar. In this system, the world's oil would be sold only and only in dollars. Previously, each country used its own currency or gold to buy and sell. Thanks to this, even though the dollar was no longer tied to gold, global demand for it would be preserved, and America's military presence became the protector of this monetary order. War was now not only happening on the battlefield, but also in oil prices, in trade routes, and in the dollar's power over the world. Vietnam and the 1971 fracture showed America a very simple truth. War seems to destroy money. And it does. If it had not taken precautions, it would have ended up on history's dusty shelves. But instead it developed strategies that pulled it out of this dead end. When the dollar was disconnected from gold, the war economy gained even greater freedom. The government could borrow whenever it wanted, print money whenever it felt like it. And naturally, the inflation created by these actions could be pushed onto the public. Everything could become harder, people could be crushed. But the war machine would not stop. This arrangement showed that war was no longer a political decision, but a financial mechanism used to create new wealth and fortunes. Money and war were no longer separate things. They were different parts of the same system. Vietnam was not a war America entered that collapsed its monetary system, nor were the military operations carried out in the name of democracy. These were simply nice words used to keep the public silent. Even though they could look like that, the real thing was this. They became the beginning of a new monetary order. From now on, war was not just a system in which only weapons companies profited. It became a mechanism that determined the power of the currency. And this mechanism would show how it turned into an age of endless wars. Why endless wars? Because when you look at the recent past, whether a small or large country or group or terrorism, whatever name is given, Iraq, Afghanistan, the war on terror. In this new period, war was not just a temporary event, it became a part of America's economically active and profitable financial system. In the next section, we will see how America turned global conflicts into a continuous income system using this unlimited financial structure. After the 9/11 attacks, the world's strongest state, America, entered Afghanistan, a country that did not even yet hold the authority to represent a state, and then Iraq for the same reason. The cost of these operations was huge, but they were said to be carried out for the safety of the American people. Yet in reality, trillions of dollars were made to circulate as a new cycle within the economy. According to calculations, the total cost of America's Iraq and Afghanistan wars, including long-term veteran care and interest expenses, exceeded $6 trillion. But nothing physically disappeared. The issue is not whether the threat existed or not. What concerns us here is that this cost means a burden that American citizens will pay for generations. But the winners were the same again. The companies that signed and received contracts to cover war expenses, the defense giants, and the financial world. The losers were the people. The safety of the American public was important. But by using these as excuses and hating behind them, the unlimited borrowing the government wanted became easier than ever. During this period, war turned into a completely independent financial mechanism. Whether the country won or lost did not matter. The winner was always obvious. When you look back at the recent past, stability was never established in Iraq and in Afghanistan. A withdrawal occurred after 20 years. Governments changed, but state policies did not, or the next one blamed the previous one. When you put aside Iraq and Afghanistan and their outcomes, the fact that the situation is still misleading becomes clear. Here we have Americans who died, families that broke apart, veterans whose psychology collapsed, and a deteriorating economic system. As history always shows and teaches us, the ones who lose and pay the price are the people, the millions. The winners are the companies. For them, it didn't matter whether the war was won or lost. What mattered to them was that the wars continued, that expenses and spending continued, and that the inward flow of money did not stop. So even though the physical battlefield of the most recent war was in Iraq and Afghanistan, the cost was felt in American households, in kitchens, supermarket shelves, and paychecks. One of the most striking summaries of the War on Terror era is this: America did not win a victory. There was no stability in Iraq. There was no freedom in Afghanistan. War became not a goal, but a business model. If you liked it or found it helpful, you can subscribe, like, or share. The choice is yours.